Hello, this is Dr. George Walters-Sleyon again with The Rush for Black Diamonds, Volume 1. Now, I want to inform you that Volume 2 will be out very soon. Now, if you haven't bought Volume 1, may I encourage you, because having Volume 1 or reading Volume 1 gives you insight into the consistency of the arguments here. That looks at the mutation of the transatlantic slave trade into chattel slavery, into colonial slavery, into penal slavery, into the post-1970 era of mass incarceration in the United States and the United Kingdom. So it's important for you to have both of them, to read the first one so as to have consistent understanding of the arguments involved. Now, today I want to look briefly at an argument by John Locke that basically created the foundation for the justification of the slave trade from his political theories. John Locke makes an argument about that slavery was perpetuated by a just war, okay? And that the slaves that were captured in Africa were captured in a just war. That Europeans and white folks came to Africa and waged a just war to capture Africans. And that Africans willingly, voluntarily gave themselves up to be enslaved. Therefore, they've got no right. Furthermore, John Locke will make the argument that because Africans voluntarily gave themselves up to white folks and Europeans, they have no right. John Locke believes in what he calls once a slave, always a slave. Let me read this statement from John Locke's two treatises of government, page 23 to 24. This is what he says. He says, "This is the perfect condition of slavery, which is nothing else but the state of war continued between a lawful conqueror and a captive." Who is the lawful conqueror? John Locke is arguing that white folks that went to Africa to enslave Africans were engaged in lawful conquering, or in a lawful conquering of Africans, and that Africans were lawfully captured, and as captives they gave themselves voluntarily. Now, no matter how inconsistent this particular argument is, John Locke came from an Enlightenment philosopher of the West. John Locke's argument will be very fundamental, very important to the establishment and validation of the slave trade and the engagement of the British Parliament and the engagement of the American Congress, particularly the third president of the United States, Thomas Jefferson. John Locke's argument also is interpreted as he contends that Africans who resisted white folks or who resisted Europeans from being enslaved were the aggressors. Africans, he says, were the aggressors against white folks and against Europeans because they refused to be enslaved. Thomas Jefferson will pick up on this argument because Thomas Jefferson, I refer to him as the Lockean president in the White House. Thomas Jefferson, like John Locke, was also a slave trader and a slave master. Furthermore, Thomas Jefferson will pick up on John Locke's argument to argue for the indeterminate enslavement of black people. Because for John Locke, it's important to note, he believes in once a slave, always a slave. And that in a civil society, black people should be indeterminately enslaved. And that particular impression, that particular interpretation, or that particular theory that John Locke advanced would be very influential to the founding fathers of the United States and the British Parliament, members of the British Parliament as well. Because Britain had its colonies in the Caribbean, all over the world, into colonialism, which we shall talk about again. But it's important to note that for Thomas Jefferson, having picked up on all the works and arguments of John Locke, Thomas Jefferson will make it in his book, The Notes, contains that black people are inferior intellectually. Now, meanwhile, remember, Thomas Jefferson was also engaged in a relationship, quote unquote, a master-slave relationship with Sally Hemings. Now, Sally Hemings was a slave girl, okay? She was also the half-sister of Thomas Jefferson's wife, Mary Wiley. So, therefore, Sally Hemings was Thomas Jefferson's sister-in-law. Sally Hemings' mother was owned by Mary Wiley's, Thomas Jefferson's wife's father. Okay? And Sally Hemings would have 6 children by or for Thomas Jefferson. Now, based on Virginia law, Thomas Jefferson was engaged in the process of slave breeding. He had no emotional ties to this because Sally Hemings was his slave. She was his slave. And she could have many children. He was simply populating his slave plantation. It's important to note that Thomas Jefferson would pick up on the works of John Locke and also begin to advance the claims for white supremacy. Both men were white supremacists. It's important to note that most of the Enlightenment fathers who were or are the intellectual godfathers of the West are white supremacists. And they were advancing the claim for the construction or the racial construction and perception of black humanity, how black people are perceived. So it's important to note that these individuals, Thomas Jefferson and John Locke, as explored in this book, provide and give you insight into not only the philosophical argument, but those arguments that will mainly transfer or influence the development of the American Constitution and the acts and policies of the American government in the early parts. Okay? With respect to slave breeding that Thomas Jefferson was involved in, I use Frederick Douglass. Now, if you read Frederick Douglass' work, especially the 4th of July speech, in there he makes an argument about the inhumane and ungodly acts of white folks breeding black people. Because in Baltimore, he says he would hear the wailing of black folks in carts taken to the slave markets by slave traders to be sold. Children, mothers, men, fathers, to be sold on the slave markets willy-nilly. He said how inhumane, how unjust and unfair that America would engage in that kind of practice. So, in this book, I explore the works and acts and behavior and engagements of Thomas Jefferson and John Locke, a British philosopher and a United States president, with respect to the transatlantic slave trade, its mutation into chattel slavery. You can find it on my website, GeorgeWalters-Sleyon.com. I encourage you to get a copy, but thank you so much for the support. And remember, this is Black History Month. Knowledge is very important. Get a copy, okay? And thank you for your support. Have a wonderful week.